Sean todos y todas bienvenidas a esta entrevista organizada como parte del curso de Fotoperiodismo de la Escuela de Ciencias de la Comunicación Colectiva de la Universidad de Costa Rica. La actividad se realiza en el laboratorio de la misma escuela y será transmitida de manera virtual mediante la plataforma de Zoom. Mi nombre es Maripaz Baila Barbosa. Curso y el día de hoy tengo el gusto de presentarles a nuestro invitado especial, fotógrafo y periodista Justin Cook. Justin hará su presentación en inglés, entonces continuaré mi participación en ese idioma. Les recordamos a las personas que nos acompañan por Zoom que pueden activar el sistema de subtítulos en caso de que necesiten apoyo con el idioma. Justin Cook is a journalist, photographer, and artist based in Durham, North Carolina. He tells stories about ordinary people who are being impacted by climate change and connects climate change to things that they are passionate about, their homes, sacred places, and history. He believes storytelling that not only shines light on these issues, but also investigates solutions is crucial for humans to live in a better relationship with the planet. Justin is a licensed drone pilot. He is a multiple Pulitzer Center grantee, and his work has been funded by the Solutions Journalism Network, the North Carolina Arts Council, the Povin Foundation, and honored by the Magenta Foundation, Pictures of the Year International, the Society of Environmental Journalists, the Society of Professional Journalists, and American Photography. When he is not making photographs, you can find him hunting for fossil shark teeth in eastern North Carolina. Thank you so much, Justin, for joining us here today. And now, without further ado, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today. Can everyone hear me all right? Yay. Okay. Thank you for the lovely introduction. So I'm going to show y'all a presentation today about how I approach solutions journalism and how I sort of work on really long-term projects about uh, how climate change is affecting communities in North Carolina. I don't typically do sort of like quick turnaround daily assignments. I typically work on projects for, a number of months or even years, which really gives me time to kind of dig in and really get to know communities and build relationships. And I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. So most of my reporting is supported by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and the Solutions Journalism Network. So I always like to give them a shout out, particularly because the journalism industry right now is deeply in crisis, and it's important to support independent journalism and journalists. But I want to do a quick exercise. When you hear the term climate visual, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And people can just answer freely.
Floodings.
Flooding, somebody said.
Flooding, fires, polar bears.
Yeah, sacked polar bears.
Yes, exactly. So if you do a search in Getty Image, their database under climate change, these are the photos that pop up. It's like protest photos, it's smokestacks, it's fire, it's drought, it's melting ice caps, it's protesters, all that sort of stuff. And these visuals are fine, but they don't tell the whole story of climate change, and they don't really tell us what people are doing about climate change at the systems level or in their own communities, and that's not good. We need to see more than this. One of the things that I really stress about my process, and especially if you guys are working in newsrooms, if there's one thing to take away from this presentation, is that to really make effective climate visuals that go beyond the cliches and the surface level photographs, it's really important for editors and writers and visual journalists like me, photographers, videographers, to collaborate early on in the process of developing the story that you're working on, so that we are all co-reporting and we have our own ownership over the work, as opposed to visuals being some sort of afterthought that people think about right before a deadline. And I'll show you some examples of why that's important. These are the 5 goals of my climate reporting. As y'all mentioned in the lovely intro, I really believe in connecting climate change to things that people are already passionate about, including their homes, their sacred places, like their cemeteries, their churches. This is a way to humanize the issue, because I believe that the more personal the story, the more universal it is and the more people can relate to it. I also believe that it's important to reflect the world as people are experiencing it and not just explain the science and data, because I think that's the best way for regular people like me and like you to see ourselves in the fight for a livable future and fighting against climate change. It's also really important for us to take our cameras places that readers have never seen before and report what I call counter narratives that shatter stereotypes. Basically, show us something new with your camera. And by doing so, you can advance understanding of a community or a climate solution. You know, we talked about cliches. I think it's important to make photographs beyond fire, smokestacks, people enjoying water parks during a heat wave. I think that's a pretty cliche image. It doesn't really tell the truth about what's actually happening during extreme heat. But the gist is what I like to do is take the science and take the climate change impacts and show the emotion. I do, there's a long tradition that I have where I try to photograph adjectives and not just nouns. So I'm trying to photograph feelings and metaphors and moments and moods. And then one of the most important things I like to think about when I'm covering climate is that I want to be proactive by showing us what a community on the front line of the climate crisis is like when it's not in crisis, and show us why it's important that this community be saved or preserved. And I think this is better than being simply reactive by capturing a place or photographing a place, the destruction that's going on there because of a climate disaster, like after the fact. Or in other words, in the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is an excellent environmental scientist and climate writer, science can give us knowing, but caring comes from someplace else. And that's sort of an idea that I live by in my work. One of the things I think is also really crucial, particularly to the way I work, is that I try to interview locals and center local experts and scientists, and I think I have sort of an interdisciplinary approach. So I'm also talking to poets and I'm reading history, and I try to build what I call a graduate level research class for myself, which not everyone has time to do, but I do that so I can understand the subject matter. And one of my favorite things to do is to get a local library card in the area where I'm working. So let's look at some examples of climate visuals from some of the work that I've done, and then we'll kind of move on to solutions journalism after this. So one of the first climate projects I ever did was about the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and the Outer Banks are a thin strand of barrier islands off the coast of North Carolina that are increasingly being affected by climate change and erosion. And I chose to tell this story by focusing on well, connecting it to things that people already care about, like I talked about earlier. So I focused on a cemetery on the edge of this chain of islands that's eroding into the ocean, essentially. You know, you see these scenes of erosion down there, they're very common. But what I like to do is to make that point and to show the erosion or the destruction and then move on to the more human element. For instance, there's a woman who still lives there in this little town called Salvo, North Carolina. Her name is Jean Hooper. She's lived there all her life. And she and her family, or her family and her husband, are buried in this cemetery. And she wants to be buried there when she passes away. It was her favorite place to play as a child. It's sort of sacred ground to her. So this was a way of taking a huge idea like climate change and making it really small, literally as small as a 50-yard by 50-yard cemetery. And this is a portrait of her I made in the Pamlico Sound, which is the water and from the cemetery. And one of her favorite activities as a child was to go there and to look at the Milky Way at night. So I photographed that as a way to kind of show her, basically photograph her memory. She keeps photographs of the cemetery, her grandfather's grave, and her family Bible. That's actually how important the place is to her. And this is her husband, Burtis Hooper. He died in 2019. and he was buried there. And this is his grave. One of the things I like to do too, we talked about the idea of translating science into emotion. When I was working on this project, I was reading a book by a pretty famous American environmental writer named Rachel Carson. And she's famous for writing a book called Silent Spring, which is about pesticides and how they're killing wildlife. But she also wrote this really beautiful book called The Sea Around Us. And The Sea Around Us is basically, it's a very lyrical and poetic book about how we all come from the ocean and we all return to the ocean when we die eventually. And I thought that was a really beautiful metaphor for Gene Hooper's story. So this is my way of trying to sort of photograph the mysteriousness of the sea. This same type of approach, I took when I started photographing and writing a story about Princeville, North Carolina. And Princeville, North Carolina is a town in the coastal plain of North Carolina, so further inland, about 100 miles inland. I'm not really sure how many kilometers that is. But it's on the Tar River, and the Tar River floods the town every time there's a big hurricane. And what I did, I tried to photograph people there in a similar way to kind of show that connection between the way they deal with hurricane flooding and the way people deal with hurricane flooding on the coast. So I photographed Kendrick Ransom and his cousin Marquetta Dickens, who run an organization that's devoted to building climate resilience and flooding resilience in Princeville in the Tar River. The Tar River is this source of life and water for a lot of the farmland in the area. It also has like it has some biblical symbolism. If you know about the U.S. South, it's a very Christian religious place. When people talk about Princeville and the flooding that happened there during Hurricane Matthew in 2016, or Hurricane Floyd in 1999, which totally flooded the town, they refer to it as a baptism sometimes. So I tried to convey that actually in these portraits that I made. I talked about counter narratives. Princeville, when it's written about and photographed in local and national media, it's typically depicted as a dying town. But my experience working there was that it's actually the opposite. It's full of life and there's lots of young people still there. So I sought that out and tried to photograph that. For instance, this was from a rodeo country line dancing night that turned into a sort of a hip hop line dancing night at this local club in town. And young people will come from all across Eastern North Carolina to come to this event. So again, a counter narrative. And I really believe in focusing on these stories that I say are kind of in my backyard, because I believe that local journalism can actually have a real impact. So in the course of working on this project, I met a woman named Ann Adams, and Ann has lived in Princeville all her life. She lives in her mother's home. And during Hurricane Matthew, the home was not seriously damaged, but damaged. And she applied for funding through a state organization called Rebuild North Carolina to get it fixed, and they fixed it. And then they reached out to her about actually tearing her home down and rebuilding it elevated so that it flooded less frequently. So she and a number of people in Princeville actually had their homes elevated. The problem was that Rebuild North Carolina was seriously mismanaged, and they set a date for her to basically have her house torn down and rebuilt, and she moved out. She started renting an apartment across the river in a town called Tarboro, and she was paying rent and she was paying a mortgage on her house. And she let people from her community come and take parts of the house away because they were just going to tear it down and scrap it. They came and took windows, they took the air conditioning and that sort of thing. And then she got a call from Rebuild and was like, oh yeah, we need to delay the demolition and elevation of your house by 6 months. And this went on for 2 years. They kept delaying it to the point that she was almost bankrupt. Her house was uninhabitable and she was running out of money. And when I started investigating this, Rebuild suddenly had all their stuff together and tore her house down and rebuilt it. And she was able to move back in 2023. And to me, that's the power of local journalism and working really intentionally with people and having intentional relationships so that you can actually like do reporting that affects their life in a positive way. And that's a lesson that I really took away from this work. But this is Anne in her backyard. And just like on the coast of North Carolina, people on the coastal plain, they really care about their land, they really care about their ancestry, and they care about their homes and sense of place. And Anne's mother actually had a cemetery in her backyard, and Anne's job is to maintain it. So, like, when we talk about connection to land, Anne is very, very much connected to this place called Princeville. In fact, this is where she will be buried when she passes away. So I made this, what I would call a drone portrait of her in her backyard, just to show the sense of scale and how connected she is. But yeah, switching to solutions journalism. Solutions journalism, what is it? What do we know about it? Have y'all heard of solutions journalism before? Maybe,
Yes.
possibly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I will give you a short crash course into what it is and then kind of show how I apply it to my projects. So solutions journalism it's a rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. And what it isn't, and this slide is really important because a lot of people think that solutions journalism is just essentially public relations for climate solutions, but really it's not. It's not telling what people to do or opinion pieces. Instead, it's reporting on actual responses to problems. It's not hero worship. Sorry, Greta Thunberg, we love you. But instead, it's using real characters like the ones that I photographed and written about to show systemic or local change. It's also not a silver bullet. So, it's not like Elon Musk who thinks he's going to solve the world with all his electric car, solve all these problems with his electric cars, because he's not. Instead, it's focusing on what the response does and actually doesn't do. Again, it's not PR or marketing. Instead, it's focusing on the actual pros and cons of something. And it's also not a theory. Instead, it's something that's already in practice. Or if the words of my favorite climate scientist, fuck hope, where's the strategy? What are we doing essentially to actually make a difference and stop the climate crisis or slow it down? This is how it works. So essentially, solutions journalism has what they call 4 pillars, and these are 4 benchmarks that you're supposed to meet in reporting. So again, we're addressing a response to a social problem and not just a person or organization, and how that response worked or why it hasn't. In fact, a solution you can learn from the actual solution itself. When it comes to visuals, it's not important to illustrate every single pillar. It's what I try to do is just illustrate the pillars that make the most sense, and then let the words serve the other pillars that they serve best. And also, my strategy is that the photos don't have to be literal or illustrate the words of the story. They can tell their own parallel story that complements the words, and also do things that the words can't do. And I'll show you a story that it's sort of a good example of that as we continue. So climate visuals and solutions journalism, they can directly show a solution or they tell a parallel story, like I just mentioned. They can be about the people who are benefiting from the solution or the why, why are they motivated to implement the solution? Really, really important thing with climate visuals, and I kind of touched on this with some of the Princeville stuff, was that these visuals can provide what's called asset framing as opposed to deficit framing. So asset framing is defining people or community by their strengths as assets, accomplishments, and aspirations, as opposed to just their challenges and obstacles. And this way we can understand people as complex and having agency, and instead of being just passive victims to climate change. And then effective solutions journalism starts with the success, shows the process, and then you understand the struggles and nuances, you delve into the story. And I think one thing you can do to accomplish that is think about how you order the pictures that you're presenting in your picture story. that can kind of set the pace and sort of allow for asset framing. Something that I threw in here today is thinking about trauma. You know, trauma robs people of the sense of agency and power. And, climate change is causing all sorts of climate-induced trauma and anxiety. But taking a trauma-informed approach to your work can actually help restore a sense of agency to people that you're working with. The other thing to think about too is communities that have experienced climate disasters and have trauma from that typically have ideas and understandings that we don't. So what I like to do in the work is to show how trauma motivates people and think about sharing the work with people as I go as a way to help them understand what I'm doing and have a sense of agency as well. So again, I think like it's important to show how trauma motivates people instead of letting it singularly define them. A second. Another thing to think about too, there's this term called fast fashion. I have a term that I call fast journalism, and that's sort of journalism with this sort of unneeded sort of sense of urgency. And sometimes we're on deadline and we have daily assignments, but the approach I'm taking, I like to really invest time in these stories because to me, time makes for better photography and better reporting. But the thing about solutions journalism is that you can apply a lot of these strategies to stories that you're working on over the course of a day, a week, a month, or even a year. So it's pretty scalable. These are examples of climate solutions visuals. This is a story I worked on in a day. It's about the USS North Carolina battleship that's in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is on the coast of North Carolina. And it experiences over 200 days a year where tidal flooding from sea level rise actually floods the entire parking lot. So me and a reporter that I work with a lot at the Washington Post went down there during what's called a king tide. And a king tide is where it's basically because of the relationship, the distance of the moon to the earth, the proximity, it causes the high tides of the day to be higher than normal. And it gave us a really good way to kind of photograph like the flooding. So, but this is an example of a story that he and I worked on in one day. We drove down. He actually helped me, do hold lights and do lit portraits of the captain, of the guy who runs the battleship. We got there right at the time of the highest tide, so we photographed the floodwater. I flew my drone to make pictures of it. But what's really cool, the solution was something they had just begun, and it was essentially restoring the marsh and the ecosystem around the battleship so that it could basically help absorb more floodwater, which is essentially a natural climate solution. They're basically just rewilding the area. So they had just begun that solution. I think they finally completed the project this year, which is pretty cool. This is another long-term project that I worked on in Princeville about an African-American farmer who was essentially using a type of organic farming technique that sequesters carbon in the soil. So the idea that if you till your soil only once a year or once every other year, it actually keeps the little fungal and microbial networks intact in the soil, which helps suck carbon out of the sky through the plants. And then the plants actually sequester carbon in the soil. And the less you till it, the less you stir that carbon up, and the less it sort of like evaporates back into the atmosphere as CO2. So this is a really fun climate solution story because also Kendrick, the farmer, was doing what I would call a multi-solving solution. It's a climate solution that solves multiple problems because he actually became a farmer because he wanted to eat healthy organic food and he wanted to feed his community because he lives in a rural part of North Carolina near Princeville called Pine Tops. And Pine Tops is what we call a food desert. There's no grocery stores. So the only food is sort of local fast food and junk food. So Kendrick started this endeavor to feed people in his community and feed his family healthy food. And it turns out he was doing something that was also a climate solution. which is pretty cool. In Princeville, just like the Outer Banks, there's a lot of homes that were flooded. There's still damage from these hurricanes. Again, I think it's important to show that damage, but I don't think it's good to linger on it. So what I always try to do is make that picture and then move on. I use historical photos to show how Black farmers in that area have existed and how they've changed since the Civil War and since slavery and sharecropping, because all those things are interconnected. In fact, these are young sharecroppers near Pine Tops in 1917, which looks a lot different than Kendrick today and his farm. This is him and one of his employees starting a new part of the farm. They're tilling it for the first time of the year. And, sometimes the solution itself isn't that visually interesting, but it's worth making a photo to show like how it works. And then focusing on like what the land looks like. So just sort of changing your perspective. So here's Kendrick doing the same thing with his tractor on a part of his land that hasn't been planted in 2 years. One of the cool things about his technique is that if you know anything about the South, for a long time, one of our biggest crops was cotton, and that's what was planted and picked by enslaved people and sharecroppers. And cotton is actually terrible for the soil. It destroyed it. It uses lots of water. It's what's called a monoculture crop. So I really wanted to photograph cotton for the story because the way Kendrick farms actually heals the soil. It restores nutrients and soil carbon. He actually calls it healing the soil or growing the soil from the damage that cotton did to it. So this is a cotton farm that I photographed from the air with my drone, just looking straight down on it. But again, the solution itself, the tilling, the no tilling, that sort of thing isn't very visually interesting, but the result of the solution is beautiful fruit and produce and beautiful soil. So what I decided to do was photograph that stuff and treat everything like a portrait. So I set up lights, like studio lights outside to photograph the soil and the vegetables and things like that, and treat it almost like I was doing a portrait shoot, the same way I photographed Kendrick himself. These are examples. These are some of his collard greens that I photograph with studio lights. And I do it in a way to make it feel still really natural. These are his, Kendrick has free range pigs that he eventually slaughters. They taste great. I've had bacon from them. Yum. I'm glad I didn't know what their names were because I would feel awful, but they were delicious. He also has a bunch of like baby chicks that he grows into hens, and they produce fresh eggs. But again, at the end of the day, the why of this story was just important to me as the what. And Kendrick does this for his kids and his community. So I tried to focus on the parallel story that complements the science story, the climate solution story, and kind of show that relationship with his children, with the community. And this is them on a day when it was like 109 degrees Fahrenheit in July, and they're working in the collard patch. It was brutally hot. I did not last long out there. They also have this event every year called the Farm Olympics. So Kendrick believes that if you're going to be a successful farmer, you have to be in shape. So they have a summer camp for kids who live in the area, and they teach them yoga, and they teach them the importance of like healthy food and organic food. And they have obstacle courses that they can play on so they can stay in shape and get healthy. I've never seen anything like this before. And so to me, it's an example of like taking your camera someplace and showing people something new, and advancing understanding, especially like what motivates people to do a climate solution to begin with. And that's him and his kids. And then, so this is the project, this next project, this is the last one I want to show, and then we can have questions and stuff like that. But how do you photograph a solution story during a climate catastrophe? Well, I took everything I learned from photographing Princeville and the Outer Banks and applied it to coverage of Hurricane Helene when it hit Western North Carolina a year ago, last week. It was absolutely devastating. The scale of it was like unlike anything I've ever seen. But I had lived in the mountains before, the region that we call Appalachia. So I understood sort of how people function there and how communities work. And one of the things I knew is that knowing your neighbors and mutual aid are things that are deeply Appalachian, particularly in this part of the country. You know, people have to fend for themselves. There's a lot of poverty. It's ignored a lot. And instead of doing a story about the suffering and desolation, what I wanted to do was a bigger story that connected all these little towns and cities in the mountains of North Carolina around the idea of community as a climate solution and show how they came together, how they came up with their own solutions, and how they filled the gaps of mutual aid using social media and relationships where government failed to help them or was too slow to respond. So this is a little town called Swannanoa, North Carolina. This is October 4th of last year. It's I think it was like 5 days after Helene hit, and it was just utterly devastated. The buildings were collapsed. There was mud and dust everywhere. But again, you know, these pictures, especially these drone photos of the destruction, are important. But it's also I don't want to linger on this stuff because I really want to show what people are doing and how they're being affected. You know, this is one of the in North Carolina we call it a holler. A holler is essentially an open spot in the woods where people live with houses, usually on a creek or a river. And this is where one of the small creeks essentially turned into a tidal wave and just destroyed an entire community to the south of Asheville. But again, you know, most importantly, I'm trying to photograph people and how they're being affected and how they're responding. These are two women, Martha on the left and Katie on the right, one in Swannanoa and one in a town called Marshall. And they were out working on their homes and doing cleanup when I got there. But what I ultimately ended up doing with the story was I built the solutions narrative around these different people who were organizing mutual aid. And it was fascinating because the more conservative religious people at the churches were essentially doing the same thing as some of the leftist anarchist organizers were doing in Asheville. So I met Sherry and her family in one of the mobile home parks that was destroyed. And I essentially built the narrative around her. She was essentially homeless for the month of October last year. Her house was destroyed. She was living in a homeless shelter. She was staying with family, but she organized mutual aid efforts at her church in Swannanoa. And she and her aunt, a woman named Punky, who is just such a really cool lady, they took their church van that they used to do their church ministry and they tore the seats out and they filled it with supplies and food and drove out into the trailer parks and fed people. So that's what I photographed. And that's the story that I worked on with her. This is their church. It's just absolutely full of food and aid supplies that were donated. This is her aunt out in the trailer parks delivering food. But as I reported, I met more and more people who were doing the same thing, kind of in their own way. And that's what the story became about. It just became about like solidarity amongst people in Appalachia, but also using social media to build community and to build networks and to build climate resilience. So the gentleman on the left, his name is Mike. He drove like 900 miles from Michigan all the way to North Carolina just to feed starving farm animals. And then on the right is a woman named Claire. And Claire and one of her friends organized a mutual aid effort through social media. So people using their own existing networks to basically build a mutual aid community in the mountains up here. And you know, to me, the easiest way to make pictures of this was to make like really like iconic portraits of them at the location where they were doing this work. You know, the story, I wrapped up this project. You know, Sherry was exhausted. She was homeless the whole time. She was doing mutual aid, and a man from her church actually donated to her an RV, which is basically like a camper trailer that she could live in. And you know, Sherry's interesting. She didn't believe in climate change. We didn't agree on things politically, but we really have a bond with each other after going through this storm together. So she ended up with this RV, which is actually the first home she's ever actually owned. So it was kind of a strange silver lining, and sort of it almost felt like a fairy tale ending to the story. But the way I built a relationship with her is I focused on the basics. Like, she didn't have a home, and I connected the catastrophe to that idea, to the most intimate space in her life, the idea of home, just like I did with all my other climate projects. Um, and that's all I have in terms of photos, unless you want to see one last project that I'm still working on that I've never shown anyone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'll show you. So remember Claire here on the right? So Claire and I have become really good friends since the storm. And I like to think that all of my climate projects have chapters. So they're never really done because things are always changing. And I wanted to start a new project up in Appalachia about mutual aid. And Claire messaged me and she was like, you should come hang out at this group that I'm a part of called the Western North Carolina Repair Cafe. And I was like, Claire, what is that? Well, she told me all about it. The Western North Carolina Repair Cafe is this group of volunteers who essentially they have these events at libraries in Western North Carolina, and there's a huge library system out there. There's probably like a dozen, or more libraries in every county, and they basically show up with their tools, and you can bring anything that you own that you can fit in your car that's broken, and they will try to fix it for you for free. Great idea, really cool people. But there's a really interesting climate connection because when Helene hit the mountains, this group was actually really indispensable for helping people fix their chainsaws and fix their gas generators. So these tools that people were using to clear trees and clear debris, they would show up at these, pop-up repair events at, the library parking lot or at some, you know, uh, department store parking lot, and they fix like hundreds of chainsaws and hundreds of generators over the course of October, November last year. And the idea they had really took off, and they got some money. And the guy who runs the repair community, his name is Dan. He's able to buy a little trailer and put solar panels on it, and now they can basically drive around the entire region and do these little repair events. It's a really great idea because it's what I call a multi-solving solution. It's kind of like what Kendrick was doing, where they're addressing building what I would call a repair and reuse economy, which is actually a really major climate solution because the more you repair things, the more you reuse them, the more the less that you buy new things. Which when every time you buy something new, there's supply chains, there's pollution, there's climate damage, all that stuff from it. And because they were indispensable during Helene for helping people repair things that they needed, because of this climate catastrophe, they built climate resilience. So they have this byproduct of like creating a climate resilient community. So I've been hanging out with them all year, photographing their events and getting to know them. They have their own sewing team. So imagine like all these really cute, like Appalachian mountain grandmas get together and they sew people's clothing. But what's really beautiful about them is that they actually get together and they talk about their trauma from Hurricane Helene because they all lost something. They all lost houses. They lost, things that they loved. People lost all their photographs. So the group itself actually functions as it has like a mental health effect, a mental health function as well, which is really important sort of in the age of climate change as we process our climate emotions. These are some of the people, approach this story in a really similar way, these really nice portraits and details. This is Ellen. She works on the sewing team. She's fantastic, just a really funny lady. But what's cool is watching this mutual aid group, the Repair Cafe, partner with other mutual aid groups. So Dan has a friend who works at this place called the Asheville Tool Library, and like literally imagine a library but for tools, where you can go and check out tools. And these are a bunch of like leftist, liberal anarchists. And Shelby was telling me about how from like day one, she and Dan had been collaborating on this program of climate resilience. And it's really fascinating because in the days after the storm, Shelby like everyone else, was using social media to basically get the word out about where they were doing their repair events and like getting people access to tools they needed. So this is all like ground up climate solution, climate resilience building, basically from scratch. It's all volunteer. Um, and this is just sort of like a taste of some of the photos. This is one of the guys, Ken, he's fixing a chainsaw. He actually uses on the right, there's the little scissor looking things. Those are actually clamps that surgeons use to clamp blood vessels during surgery, but he uses them to clamp the hoses inside the chainsaw that have like oil and gas in them to keep them from spraying everywhere. So I love that, like just sort of creativity, like reusing surgical tools to do repair work on chainsaws. Um, but that's it. That's what I got in terms of photos. I'm tired of hearing myself talk, so I'm gonna end my sharing and open it to questions or comments or smart aleck remarks. You guys can ask me anything.
Thank you very much, Justin, for your time and for sharing your knowledge. Now we're going to have some space for questions. Ahora vamos a tener un espacio de preguntas. So the first person is Floricel.
Yeah. Hello, Justin.
Hey,
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything you showed us today. Well, my question reads, Justin, I want to bring up a quote of yours from an interview with the Bitter Saturner, which reads, I've tried hard to quiet my own voice and amplify the voices in these communities. I don't need to give them a voice. They have one. I don't need to humanize them. They are human. We just need to be better listeners. We need to actually hear. So racial oppression is a real thing in the South, just as it can be in the media we consume. How, and definitely the pictures that I saw, like your pictures in Durham, they are very powerful, very sentient. So how is this balance achieved? How do we become better listeners in order to become better photojournalists? Thank you.
that's such a great question. And thank you for asking. You know, the work that I did in Durham, photographing these communities that were affected by gun violence, they're the ones who taught me these things and the lessons I learned from them, particularly in investing time in communities and really building intentional relationships, is how I learned the idea of taking a trauma-informed response to my work. The way I cover climate change is essentially the way I would cover things in Durham around gun violence. So to me, the biggest lesson was the having time to invest in people and in these communities and really getting to know them, as opposed to what I call parachute journalism, where you parachute in and parachute out really quickly. Sometimes we don't have that kind of time, but what I like to do is if I am on a short deadline, really keep in touch with people, and really be transparent about what my intentions are and what I'm trying to do and build those intentional relationships. That way, when I have time, I can dig in and do like a much deeper story. It's, you know, a lot of it, you know, like I'm a white guy and I'm, you know, Princeville is an African American town, you know, and the South has like a huge Hispanic and African American population. But I think what's helped me too is just learning how, I mean, just really just sitting with people and listening. And you know, a lot of times I'll be working on a project and like I won't even take my camera out of the bag the first few times I'm there. I'll just come and hang out with people and really get to understand them and get to know them, before I even start making photos. So to me, it's like it's kind of working from that relationship first. It's kind of different when you're working, you know, in a hurricane like Helene. You have to you're there and you have to do the work. But I think like you know, one of the things I did when I covered Helene, it's really similar to what I did when I covered Durham. There's this idea of psychological first aid. So when you're working with people who've been traumatized by gun violence or have been traumatized by climate change, often you're the first person that they're talking to about their intense feelings and their trauma, you as a journalist. So understanding how to talk to them and how to listen is really important. You know, Jocelyn Sims, the woman that I photographed 15 years ago in Durham for the Bitter Southerner. The thing that she really taught me, that made me really remember, is that she made me understand that I actually listened and heard her and affirmed her experience. And also, I made her feel seen. That's what she always told me. So when I was in Appalachia working with people who were working class, who were just suffering this climate disaster, the first thing I really wanted to do is understand like how I could provide psychological first aid. It's like when I would sit and interview and talk to Sherry, Sherry would tell me about like all of her, she'd be processing all of her feelings and emotion with me. And one of the things she told me, she was like, Justin, you're the first person to affirm my feelings this whole time. And that's something that Jocelyn taught me how to do early on 15 years ago. So in short, a lot of it is just really sitting with people and really listening and listening to understand as opposed to like listening to respond, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, definitely. Just like a quick yes, no answer. Have you had some sort of like psychological training, like in order to report and cover this type of areas?
No, and there really isn't. I don't think there really is good psychological training. I tell people I got my training from the streets. So, and I'm not like, I don't think that I'm always perfect at it, but there are some resources out there. There's an organization called the Dart Center. They basically focus on trauma informed reporting. So part of it is like, like when we're covering these events, we're being traumatized as well. So it's about learning how to, you know, minimize our own trauma and also not traumatizing or re-traumatizing the people that we're working with. So there's a lot of ideas. They have a great resource, but I have not received any official training other than just doing the work and figuring it out. So
Thank you so much for your answers.
sure, thank you.
Okay,
Howdy.
well, hi there. Well, first of all, hello, Justin. Thank you so much for the time. I just wanted to ask you something. Well, as currently as the far right, well, I'm just going to read it, sorry. As the far right gains ground, the fight against climate change and activism are increasingly questioned, and the discourse against them occupies more space. What do you consider is the most essential value that photojournalism provides, and how can it be coupled with greater public consensus or people's actions?
That's a great question. Like in my work, it is never my goal to convince people that climate change is real. I actually don't care what they think because I think that's a losing battle. Like to me, it's to um, report on what people are doing and how they're being affected by climate change, whether they realize it or not. And my strategy, as opposed to beating people over the head with facts about climate change, is to let them see themselves in it and let them figure it out. An example I have, Sherry, the woman I photographed in Swananoa, she told me point blank that she doesn't believe in climate change. And to me, like, okay, great. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, there's not much I can do with it. But what I realized is that I was the first reporter and journalist she ever had an encounter with. So what I understand my job is, I'm not just reporting, I'm also creating an experience for people. I might be the only person that she experiences climate journalism or the ideas of climate change through, despite whatever she's seen on Fox News, whatever. To me, it's my job to be this ambassador and this messenger about not only climate change, but like, who are the people who care about this stuff? Like, I want to shatter her stereotypes of who I am. And, the whole time I was out there, she was constantly asking me about climate change. You could tell she was really curious, but I didn't really talk about whether it was real or not. I just talked to her about my experiences, my reporting. And, by the end of it, she was like, I don't think I believe in climate change. I think this is just the end times. I think it's just Jesus coming back. She's very religious. And I was like, Sherry, maybe it is. I have no idea. Like, but we do know that climate's changing and all this stuff. But like, part of it to me, like, I want to have actual relationships with people. And I think that's the way you win them over. Um, the thing I recognize with places like Swannanoa, Sherry, like a lot of the folks there, they're working class. They don't actually have a lot of time to read really in-depth climate reporting, and they don't have time to, really think about climate change because they're trying to work and pay their rent. So I think, again, going back, connecting climate change to things that they already care about, and sort of introducing them to it that way is a more effective way than just being like, climate change is real and there's 450 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere and blah 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 blah. Like who wants to hear that? Like no one, you can't do anything with that information, I don't think. So there are other people who might be better at that than I am, but I think my role, being, rendering psychological first aid, being someone who listens, being someone who helps people see themselves in the climate crisis, I think I'm better suited for that, if that makes sense. Did I answer your question?
Oh yeah, for sure. Actually, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think about what you asked all the time, truly. Like, it's so important. Like, it's so important.
Well, hello. My question is, how can we convince others that photojournalism is as important as normal reporting?
We show them. Well, I mean, I think, what I like to do is I like to be a better reporter than them. And I like to think that I sometimes can be a better reporter than other reporters because I am a photographer, because I have to be there. Like I have to show up. Like I can't just make phone calls about Swannanoa and Hurricane Helene. I have to be on the ground. And I think that's the difference between us sometimes. Like sometimes reporters, they only work from the phone or from the computer, but photographers, we have to be there. We have to develop those relationships. And I think that my favorite thing to do is to work with a reporter who has my values. So like the story I did for the Washington Post about the battleship, the reporter I worked with, he loves photography. He loves photojournalism. He loves getting access to intimate moments. So like he and I knew we would work really well together. So like what I try to do is to change the culture that way by working with reporters who understand what I do. And that way I don't have to explain myself. But when I was on that assignment, this guy Brady, the reporter, I was teasing him the whole time because he was like, "Oh, you should check out over there. There's a really cool photo." And I was like, "That's great, Brady. I have a really good idea for the lead for your story." He would like roll his eyes at me because I was like joking. But I actually did have an idea for his lead, and I think he actually took the idea a little bit and ran with it. So I think I think collaborating is the best way. It's showing people what you're capable of.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, Justin. Very nice to meet you. My name is Gina Alfaro, and my question is, today, thanks to technology, we are constantly bombarded with images from all over the world and of every kind of situation, which has gradually led to desensitization. How do you approach sensitive topics in your work, avoiding the normalization of difficult situations while still addressing them to inform and raise awareness?
That's a really good question. I think like when I was younger, I believed that my job was to be in the most intense situations possible with my camera and just show like really intense moments, like whether it was like war or things like that. But the older I get, like you said, I realize people get desensitized by that stuff. I mean, a perfect example, if you get on Instagram right now, you can see an entire live stream of like dead people in Gaza. And like after a while, like it's hard to look at that stuff. But I think like instead, I think it goes back to taking climate change and connecting it to the things that people care about. Because you can make a picture of climate destruction, but you're also connecting that to people's lives beyond the climate crisis. So that I think that people are more likely to resonate with that work. I think the solutions approach too is better. Personally, the solutions journalism approach is better for my mental health, because if I was just out there photographing climate disaster, I would just go crazy. But the fact that I'm focusing on what people are doing and focusing on possibility, I think that's better for my emotional well-being. I think it's better for my reporting. But I also think that, I mean, there's studies about this, but solutions reporting resonates with people more. They're more likely to respond to solutions reporting as opposed to just seeing like a bunch of houses that burn down or whatnot. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's moving away from what I would call the trauma porn.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello. How much of your work is achieved in post-production?
So I try to do very minimal post-production work. So I abide by the rules of photojournalism and documentary photography. So I'm not adding or subtracting information from the pictures. I'm only adjusting for like contrast and exposure and things like that. So I keep it really simple. Like I'll, darken the sky a little bit. I'll dodge someone out a little, but I'm not like, I'm not like adding fire to the background or anything like that. But just keeping it as honest as possible. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, Justin. So climate photojournalism involves long processes, as you mentioned before, and experiencing harsh realities and maintaining an emotional commitment to communities. In your experience, how do you manage to find a balance between the demands of this hard work and the need to take care of yourself without neglecting the quality of or ethics that these that the minds involves?
Balance. What's that? No, I think I find balance by not working all the time. I find balance by having healthy boundaries between my work and my personal life. Um, like when I was young in my 20s and early 30s, I would work, 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 work all the time. All I thought about was photography. And frankly, I don't have that type of energy anymore, because the older I get, the more I realize I have other interests in life. So like I like to garden, I like to go fossil hunting, I like to read books. And I find now that when I'm doing these long-term climate projects, that I actually have more stamina if I'm not doing it all the time, and if I'm investing in my time off, in my hobbies, um, learning about other things, reading about other things, all that stuff kind of comes back to me having um, basically fresh capacity to work on these stories. The other thing, one of my rules this year, I was like, I'm only going to work on climate stories that are cute and have cute people in them. And that sounds silly, but that's what I've totally been doing. Like the people up in Asheville that I'm working with are adorable. They're so much fun to work with. So that project, like it's a climate project, but it's not soul sucking. It's like fun to work on. When I go up there, I like look forward to being with these people. They're hilarious. They're really smart. It's basically like having a bunch of neurodivergent people with ADHD in a room together, and they're just like taking things apart and fixing them. And they all want to talk to me. They all want to tell me their story. And I leave, and come back to Durham, and I feel full. And that was a revelation to me that like this reporting doesn't have to be brutal and exhausting all the time. That, if you have the time and you have the grants and you have the clients, you can find stories that are actually life-giving as opposed to life-sucking. If that makes any sense.
Thank you very much.
Oh, one last tip. My favorite thing right now is I take naps. Taking naps is great.
I also love that. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Well, hello, my name is Fernando, and my question is, in addition to your work in climate change coverage, photography, you have also photographed events such as the aftermath of the 2015 shooting in Chapel Hill. Is there a difference in how you approach a human drama linked to the environment compared to one linked to tragedies such as the one mentioned above?
You're talking about Jaden, that kid that was killed? Can you repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, it's the aftermath of the shooting in 2015 in Chapel Hill. Yeah, I think
Oh,
it's
Chapel Hill. Yeah.
Chapel.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about with the Muslim students. That was awful. I mean, if I'm going to be really real, like gun violence in America and climate change are all symptoms of the bigger issue of capitalism and colonialism. Because to me, I feel like I'm photographing symptoms of the same monster. It's like this giant American nightmare. Um, I mean, I think that the people who, in this country who suffer from gun violence are typically working class people, whether it's in Durham, that sort of thing. So I think like it's easy for me to connect these topics because to me they're the symptom of a larger problem in our culture and in our world, if that makes any sense. But I think like, I don't really have I don't have the emotional energy to cover gun violence anymore. I did that for so long. I just can't spiritually or emotionally handle it. And it sounds crazy, but climate change is actually better for me to cover, even though it's a hard topic. But I think like just as your colleague asked earlier, it's like I'm trying to find stories that aren't necessarily about like all the trauma and all the chaos. It's more about what people are doing. I think the solutions approach is healthier for me, if that makes sense at all. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Hi. My question is a bit long, so I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Um, for your ongoing project, Purple New Deal, you did some product photography. Okay. You did some product photography, and a few weeks ago we did a short in-class exercise on this type of photography, but we only had like a few minutes, the product and the school, well, the faculty's facilities to take the photo, so it was a bit difficult to convey the intended message. The exercise gave me the feeling that photographing products with little preparation was much more difficult than photographing a person with little preparation. So my question is, in your experience, does photographing a product require more thought than photographing a person? And what would you say are the key differences between these two types of photography?
So photographing a person versus a thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
I mean, I think it all takes a lot of work. I think it just depends, so often when I do portrait photography, I work with two assistants who help me like with lights and stuff like that. So when I Purple New Deal, if that whole project was a project that me and some friends did for fun, we're going back to how we find balance. Like one of the ways I find balance is that me and my friends go out and make really ridiculous photo projects just for shits and giggles because photography is fun and it doesn't have to be serious all the time. So that project, I was photographing my friends with my friends. We had like a whole crew. So it didn't really feel like work. It was like people I'd worked with before. Like there's a photograph of my friend Vicky with like the flowers and stuff like that. Like my friend Lauren and I photographed her, and Lauren and I have worked together a million times. So we know how to work together. There are parts of that project where I was photographing what I call still lifes, like things. A lot of that stuff takes just as much work because it's just me in my studio moving stuff around and moving lights around. But I treat it all the same. I photograph everything like it's a portrait with lights to kind of maintain that same aesthetic. But it just depends on what I'm photographing. Like tomorrow I'm doing a portrait down in Wilmington near the battleship again. It'll just be me and one person and I'll have one light. and I have no idea what I'm going to do. I have no plan at all, none. But that's okay because sometimes it's just good to show up and see what's there and just to make it happen like out of the blue. And I think that's going to be my strategy tomorrow. And I'll let you know if it works or not. It's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Justin. I'm Alejandro Sanchez. Nice to meet you.
Pleasure.
Um, First of all, well, as photographers, we leave a mark on the communities being depicted. So then I would like to ask how important is the feedback of those individuals in your ethical decisions, right? Have you experienced a situation where someone asked you to share a photo or a moment when you returned to show sorry, to a community?
You mean like critical feedback?
Yes, mainly.
Um, Not in my journalism work. Um, I think like one of the things, well, that's not true. Um, there's a picture of Jocelyn Sims that I made of her like 15 years ago where her son was killed and she's crying and she hates that photo. She absolutely can't stand that photo. And I know why she doesn't like it because I think for her, it shows her like this really weak moment. But we've had a lot of conversations about that picture. And what she says is that even though she doesn't like it, she understands why it's important and why it's powerful. But to be honest, like this this is my favorite photo of her. Hang on. It's her in the sunflowers, which might be hard to see.
Yeah.
But that's a photo. I'll bring it up on my computer. But it's this photo of her in some sunflowers that are like it's on my wall. But it was a portrait where like I years later I worked with her and I was like, yeah, I hate that portrait of you. So like let's make another one. So we went to this huge sunflower field in Raleigh and we took turns photographing each other. She photographed me and I photographed her. And that's like become her favorite photo that I've ever made of her. And she's always like, I want that on my like at my funeral. And so I was like, okay, like that's a big compliment. But like, that's probably the best example I can give of that. But because I have a relationship with Jocelyn, like we talk about that and we work through it. And I think it goes back to that importance of like keeping in touch with people, if that makes sense at all. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Hi, Justin. Nice to meet you. My name is Adair Mendez. My question is, what do you think someone who wants to dedicate himself to photojournalism needs today to develop their own perspective and sustain it over time?
Can you ask that one more time?
What do you think someone who wants to dedicate himself to photojournalism needs today to develop their own perspective and sustain it over time?
What do people need to do to develop like their approach to photojournalism? Or I mean, I think my advice to anyone becoming a photojournalist is that to photograph a lot, find stories in your own backyard. To me, like the best stories are not like 1,000 miles away in Africa. They're like right in your backyard. They're like in your home state. You don't have to go far for them. And I think the biggest thing is trying to figure out like and develop your voice as a photographer and how you approach things. And the only way you can do that is by getting out and like making lots of pictures and getting feedback from people who you respect. Um, the other thing too is that the traditional path that I had when I graduated and I worked for newspapers, that really isn't a career path anymore. But like I tell my students that, the skills you learn as a photojournalist are translatable and transferable to other fields. So like I do a lot of like advertising and marketing photography that actually makes more money. But I'm able to do that because of my skills as a photojournalist. Or there are tons of organizations who need photojournalism style photography for their campaigns, you know, whether it's a climate organization or a human rights organization. So like my advice is to think beyond the journalism field and also think about like nonprofits and organizations that also could like use your work as well, if that makes sense at all. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Justin.
Hello.
My name is Alejandro. Hello. My question is, one of your main focuses is climate change and its impacts on communities. So what have you learned about those stories that is not usually told in the media?
I think this story I don't hear about in the media is the effects of climate change on people's mental health. I think I don't really hear a lot about that. I think that so much of the coverage is about like physical damage to communities, but people are as climate change accelerates, they're experiencing all these different climate emotions. And I think that stuff is really interesting because there's like a popular term called climate anxiety that people focus on, but there's so many other different climate emotions. And there's one in particular that I wrote about and thought about a lot on the Outer Banks. It's called solastalgia. And solastalgia is a lot like nostalgia, but it's this idea that you feel uncomfortable or not at ease or not even at home in your home environment because of the effect of climate change rendering your home unfamiliar. So like for instance, on the Outer Banks, like people are watching the island erode away, they're watching the houses fall into the ocean. And when you talk to people out there, they feel this feeling of solastalgia where they essentially feel like they don't recognize their home environment anymore because of all the environmental change. And that's such an interesting phenomenon because there's people all over the place that are experiencing that sort of feeling, but they don't necessarily have the words for it because we're just now coming up with the terms. I think that's a really interesting underreported story, like how people are psychologically responding to climate. If that makes sense.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
In several of your works, you find yourself in dangerous places or areas recently hit by a meteorological event. Sorry, what are the primary considerations for working in those locations, considering the instability of the place and the vulnerable situation in which people can be found?
That is such a good question. So let me talk about Hurricane Helene. So when Helene hit, there was no cell phone service, there was no running water, and the gas stations were out of gas and people were running out of food. So every trip I made to Western North Carolina, I brought my own food, I brought my own water, and I brought my own gas, and I brought enough to share. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you go into a disaster area and you become a liability for everyone else. And you end up taking up their resources that are scarce. So I made sure that like when I was up there, I stayed with people who were somewhat removed from the disaster area, who had fewer concerns about their water and their electricity. And at any chance I get, I would bring enough with me that I could donate stuff to people. The other thing I would do when I covered Helene, particularly at this church that I covered, people were showing up with truckloads of donations. And they were getting things that they didn't even need. So I would talk to them and be like, what do you guys actually need? Because I'm going back to Durham and I'm coming back. So they would tell me like, oh, we need batteries, or we need, they needed portable showers. One of them joked that they needed a recreational vehicle. And I was like, I can't help you with that, but I can help you find batteries and all this other stuff. So I came back with supplies that I knew they needed. And there's a lot of conversations about like, what is my job? My job is to only make pictures and report. Like, I don't believe that shit. I think that's bullshit. I think we're humans. And I think that when you're in a disaster, of that magnitude, it's important to be a human first, because if I can bring something up there that can help save someone's life, then I'm going to do it. So that's what I would do. And so I think the biggest thing is, one, be prepared, um, have emergency plans, have a way to get in touch with people, have a safe place to stay. And the other one is just really don't take up more resources than you need to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
That is such a great question. Such a great question.
No, that's great. Sorry. Well, I just want to make you another question. Sorry, a friend of mine is actually asking me to ask you. So now that you incorporate drone shots in your photographies, how do you decide when a picture needs a full detail shot or a zoom out?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, a good example of, like, you know, the story about the repair cafe. I particularly wanted to get a photo of someone's hands covered in grease. So I spent one whole trip up there waiting on this one guy who was taking apart an engine to get his hands covered in grease. And I had my macro lens on my camera for 45 minutes just waiting to get that photo. And there were all these other things going on around me that I could have photographed, but I was so, like, ADHD, autistically hyper focused on that one thing that I just didn't pay attention to the rest of it, and waited and waited and waited until I made that photo. That's kind of how my brain works. You know, there was another trip where, like, my one goal was to make what I call a scene setter photo, to basically photograph, like, the wide scene of, like, all these people working. And I don't think I've successfully made that photo yet for that story, so I'm going to go back. So what I like to do, I make a list of themes. So not necessarily like people or whatever. I make a list of, like, ideas that I want to photograph. So, like, you know, the idea of greasy hands, or the idea of companionships. Like, I was trying to wait for moments of interaction between people. One of the things I want to do with that story is photograph people who become friends through the repair cafe, but also continue to spend time, like, beyond the cafe. So it's like I come up with these, like, thematic ideas that I look for that, like, you know, after the reporting, I think will illustrate the story. And then from there, it's just a matter of, like, what type of lens works to make that photo the best, if that makes sense. Great question. We should do a podcast.
Thank you so much, Justin, for your time. Ahora damos por finalizada la entrevista. No sin antes agradecer, thank you, Justin Cook, por el espacio y por darnos la oportunidad de aprender más en la materia de fotoperiodismo. Sin más que añadir, esta fue una entrevista realizada por el énfasis de periodismo de la Escuela de Ciencias de la Comunicación Colectiva de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Mi nombre es Maripaz Padilla Barbosa, estudiante del curso de fotoperiodismo en el segundo semestre del 2025. Muchas gracias por su compañía. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so much fun. Thanks for all your great questions. I hope I didn't bore you to sleep.
You agree.